Hi, my name is Casey and I don't know what I'm doing. Today I'm going to be doing my May wrap-up. I read 11 things in the month of May. I'm going to talk about these in alphabetical order by title, and so let's get going. The first one I have here is Blackwater Sister by Zen Cho. I ended up listening to the audiobook version of this, and I really can't recommend it enough. It was really, really beautifully narrated. If you're like me and extremely white and not very familiar with Malaysia or the variety of languages that are spoken in Malaysia, the audiobook is really helpful. It's really helpful to hear how certain people's titles are pronounced, how their names are pronounced, and honestly, the narrator did such a beautiful job. This story follows Jess, a young girl whose family is moving back to Malaysia after they immigrated to the United States when she was very young. And she is a little dissatisfied with her life. She's recently left college. She is still not out to her family, and her relationship with her girlfriend struggles a little bit because of this, and she's just dealing with a whole bunch of personal problems when she realizes that she's being haunted by the ghost of her grandmother, and this haunting pulls her into the spiritual world that she has never really known. And it's honestly a really fun romp while still being very serious and dealing with a lot of very serious subjects very well. It was really beautiful. It was really sad in certain places, and it was really funny in others. This was just a really, really fun book to read, and I very much enjoyed it. With this one, it was really, really good. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The next book I have is Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. This, the subtitle for this is How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead. I picked this one up because of my therapist. She recommended Brené Brown, and so I picked up a couple of her books, and this is the first of hers that I've read. As the subtitle says, this talks a lot about vulnerability. It talks a little bit about shame. It talks about the ways that that affects our lives through multiple aspects of our lives. This one was very much outside of my comfort zone. I don't read a lot of personal growth or self-help style nonfiction. I read a lot more just, a particular subject and a deep dive into that. The author did such a good job of balancing out, the topics on vulnerability and shame, and while also still being really personal, still being a little funny, still being very interesting. I will say I really wish that this had done a deeper dive on shame and vulnerability. And it's like the entire book is centered around that, but it would feel like by the time we were like really getting into a certain aspect of that, it was moving on to the next thing. And I just really wanted it to keep going and talking about these things. But overall, this was very enjoyable. I didn't give this a star rating because I didn't really feel comfortable giving it one. But it was very worthwhile to read. It did discuss things very well in a very interesting way, and it was very much something that I'm glad I got to this month. The next one I have is Down Days by Ilse Hugo. I read this one primarily because of the buzzword reading challenge for the month. It was a direction, so north, south, east, west, up, down, left, right, middle, anything like that. And I just grabbed this book because honestly the cover is so interesting. I had no idea what it was about before I started reading it. I just really love the cover. This is on my Goodreads on my purely for the cover shelf. And I'm really glad I ended up picking this one up. This one is set during a pandemic. A deadly outbreak of laughter has occurred. This is partially based off of and inspired by the laughing epidemic that took place in Tanzania a while back. And it was really, really interesting. I've read a couple of books that have been more recently published in the last few years that I feel like you could tell were written, right before the pandemic and the COVID-19 outbreak. And you could tell that there were certain things that they got right and certain things that they got wrong. And I feel like this one you could tell was written during the pandemic. There were so many things that were very much what's happening in the world and very relatable. It was so interesting to see them talk about, people still not taking it seriously, people thinking it's a hoax, people not believing in the vaccine, all these aspects that, you know, we deal with in the world today. It was very interesting. The story follows several people, including a young woman who has lost her baby brother. He's been kidnapped. A woman who is a dead collector who drives around and collects the dead so that their bodies can be disposed of. A man who is in a very illicit business that is quite surprising what it is. And it's their lives as they intersect and they intertwine throughout this, like, I think this takes place over the course of a week. This one for me was a really fun read, and I was very much enjoying it, but it wasn't like doing anything stand out. And then it took a turn. It took a turn probably about 2/3 of the way through the book, where there was this sudden twist and the sudden change in story, and I really enjoyed it. It was very strange. I don't know that it made the most sense, but I thought that it hung together well enough, and it changed up the pace enough to make it so much more interesting and so much more engaging. And I think one of the best things it did whenever this comes into play is it made so many of these characters that we're only getting the briefest snapshot into their lives. It made them more whole and more interesting, and you really got to see more of who they were as people. And I loved that so much. It was absolutely fascinating and interesting, and it was really fun. And it's also just got this beautiful cover. So I ended up giving this 4 stars. The next book I have is Folk Songs for Trauma Surgeons by Keith Rawson. This is a short story collection. Like any short story collection, it's got its ups and downs. Some were rather meh, and some were really, really good. I don't know that there was anything that would be like a new favorite short story of mine in here, but I'm very much interested to read more from this author. There are a couple of short stories in here that I thought were really, really just on the brink of really incredible. And they were so good and they were so interesting, and there's so much in here about just being a person and the hardships of being a person and interpersonal relationships and the ways we interact, you know, not just with each other, but with ourselves. And I love those kinds of themes. And that's throughout almost every short story in here. My only real criticism is that there are several short stories in here that have such interesting, fascinating premises and concepts and ideas around them, but they almost just never quite get off the ground. It takes too long to get going, it takes a while to find its footing, and because they're short stories, by the time it does, we're at the end. And that was sort of disappointing, but overall, this was a really great collection, and I ended up giving, I think I did the average when I averaged them all out, and it ended up being a 3.75. So I ended up giving this 4 stars on Goodreads. The next one I have here was my favorite from this month, and it is my favorite of the year so far, and it is Gore Details by Erica Engelhaupt. This is a collection of fascinating essays on a variety of topics. The tagline for this one is Adventures from the Dark Side of Science, and that's pretty accurate. It had a variety of topics it dealt with. It was sectioned off really well. There would be this whole section about of essays that dealt with the ick factor and grossness. And yes, absolutely did. Others that dealt with decomposition. And it was so interesting. It was so fascinating. I got the audiobook from Libby and I loved it. This was so fun. It was so weird and gross and just absolutely fascinating. I had such a hard time putting this down. At any point in time, I would find excuses to be like, oh, I need to go to the grocery store so I could listen to the audiobook more. It was so good. It's been my favorite book that I've read this year. And it's one I'm probably going to give a lot of people at Christmas, or at least recommend to a lot of people, depending on how strong of a stomach they have, because it does get gory and a little bit gross at times. But I really can't recommend this one enough, especially if you're a fan of Mary Roach. It's very similar in style, although 2 very distinct authors, and it was absolutely wonderful. It was wonderful, and it's my favorite book that I've read this year. Also 5 stars, if I didn't say that already. 5 fucking stars. The next one I have is A Room Away from the Wolves by Nova Rinsuma. This one follows a young girl named Bina who is sort of on the run from her family and just her old life, and she finds herself in New York, and she's sort of retracing her mother's wild days and her previous footsteps. She takes a room at this residence for, troubled girls called Catherine House, where her mother stayed before she had her, and it just kind of follows her growing up and her kind of coming to terms with a lot of the hardships in her life and a lot of the things that she's had to endure and a lot of who she is because of it. This one I honestly felt like I was just a little too old for, being 33 now. If I had read this when I was like 16 or maybe even like 19 or 20, I think this would have been a lot more impactful. Overall, it was a good story. It was just like barely keeping my attention. And it was just short enough for me to really just keep pushing and keep going with it as quickly as I could to try to get it in this month. And it wasn't until the last 5% that I really fell in love with this. The last 5% did something that I can't really talk about that I think might be too strange or out there for a decent amount of readers, but for me, it was the perfect way to end this story and to end Bina's journey. And I really enjoyed it. And so that last 5% bumped this up from like a 3-star to a 4-star for me. The next one I have is Censor by Junji Ito. This was unfortunately just a 3-star for me, mostly because of the art, because I think Junji Ito is an incredible manga artist. The story really just falls flat for me. You're following a young woman who is walking and hiking along this mountain where there is a volcano, and a man approaches her saying that he and the village have been waiting for her. And when she arrives to the village, it's covered in volcanic hair. And that's really where the story kicks off. It gets very cosmic, very strange, and just, for me, it just doesn't hold together well enough. It's a little too big, and it didn't do anything to really ground it too much at any point for me. But it was a very quick read. It was a very fun read. And it's still, classic Junji Ito, really terrifying, horrible, awful body horror and artwork. And I just love that aspect of it. Okay, so the next one I have is an Amazon Kindle collection, and it is the Trespass collection. I'm very quickly going to talk about the short stories and my impressions. I read this at the very beginning of the month, so don't recall the entire synopsis for each one, so I'm not going to try to give a synopsis for each one. But the collection as a whole deals with a lot of environmental and ecological damage and nature's response to that damage and nature's response to humanity as a whole. That's very much the theme of the whole collection. So going in order, we have The Tiger Came to the Mountains by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a 3-star for me. I very much enjoyed it. It was fun, but did not think it was her best work. And yeah, so I ultimately just gave it 3 stars. Number 2 is Wildlife by Jeff Vandermeer. This was a 4-star short story for me. This was one of my favorites of the whole collection. I love Jeff Vandermeer's writing. It's weird, it's a little strange, it's a little creepy, it's a little spooky. There's very much an ominous feeling. Very much all these things that are present in a lot of what he writes, and I thought it was overall very well executed. Number 3 is The Backbone of the World by Stephen Graham Jones. Again, another 4-star short story for me. I love anything Stephen Graham Jones, especially his shorter work. I always find super, super compelling. This was no different. It was very strange, very weird, and just really unsettling, and I really loved it so much, and I will never look at Prairie Dogs the same way again. Number 4 was my favorite of the collection. That is Stag by Karen Russell. I have never read anything by this author before, and I am definitely going to go out and pick up more of their work now. This one, it was so weird. It was very weird. It was very isolated to one event and very much just in one person's head the whole time. And just a little, I just keep wanting to call it weird because it was. But that's not very descriptive for you as a viewer. But overall, I thought this one did such a great job of, really examining the way that we react to the climate catastrophe currently going on and the way that nature is having to sort of rebound from that, and at times the way it just doesn't. And it's so interesting. It was very intriguing, and I was very much captivated by this. And this was another 4-star short story, but definitely my favorite. Number 5 is A Righteous Man by Tochi Onobuchi. This one was, again, another 4-star. A lot of 4 stars in this collection. I don't really know what to say about this one, except that I very much enjoyed it. This was the first thing I have read from this author, and I am excited to read more from them. And the last short story in this collection is A Bloody Summer by Carmen Maria Machado. This was unfortunately just a 3-star for me. It was very interesting. It was very, very weird, just like a lot of these other ones, but it ultimately just didn't reach the same peaks that some of these other short stories did for me. Overall, this was a very good collection. I'm very glad I read it. I was very much pulled in by the covers and the artwork for these short stories. They were so good, and I'm really glad that I made time for these this month. Okay, the next one I have here is The Wastelands by Stephen King. This is book 3 in the Dark Tower series, and this is my favorite in the series. I have a vlog where I read this and book 2. I will link that down below so you can see more of my full thoughts. But this is still 5 stars for me. This still holds up for me. I was very nervous to go back and reread this. There are some scenes in here that I wasn't sure were going to hold up as well as I had hoped they would, and they absolutely did. It's still absolutely my favorite. I love Eddie so much, and this is really the book where Eddie comes into his own and really becomes the man that he is not only supposed to be, but that he wants to be. And I love that so much. And I love Jake, and this is the first book where we get Oi, and Oi is precious to me, and I will fight anyone who disagrees. And yeah, I love this book, and I'm so happy I reread it. The next book I have is Where They Wait by Scott Carson. Overall, this was a 2-star for me. This follows Nick, who has recently been laid off from his reporter job at a prestigious newspaper. He's given an opportunity to run back to his hometown and to cover a story about this new startup that is taking foot in his old hometown and is based a lot on his mother's neurological research. And, you know, creepy things ensue, and some not creepy things ensue. I think it's worth noting that the startup deals in sleep assistance and meditation and things of that nature. And unfortunately, this one just fell so flat for me. It has, I think, the idea of, you know, focusing around this kind of mystery with this startup company, and particularly one that deals in sleep assistance and meditation, is so interesting, and I think there's a lot to play with there that would make it even creepier and weirder and more unsettling, and it just fell flat for me. It felt more like a thriller or a mystery novel to me. This was one of the ones that I read because of the Goodreads Best of Horror list for 2021, and I don't know that this would belong on that list. I'm not saying that it's not horror, because there are really frightening elements to it and scenes, and I think it is horror, but to me it just feels more like a mystery thriller, and I think that there are other things that could have been in its place on that list. All that being said, it's interesting enough. I've seen that it has, you know, some really good ratings on Goodreads. It just unfortunately did not work for me. I think some of the things that it did with the plot and with the characters just ultimately didn't land for me. It just didn't really resonate, and I don't think it held together very well. And, you know, if this is your first video of mine you're watching, I will talk a lot about characters, because that's my favorite thing in books, is the characters. And the characters in this one are so flat, and they're so two-dimensional, and they just don't live up to any of the little promise that there is for them at the beginning. So unfortunately, this was my worst book of the month. The last book that I have is unfortunately my most disappointing read of the entire month. And that is The Wild Ones by Nafisa Azad. This is still a 3-star read for me, but I really thought I was going to love this. I thought I was going to fall in love with this. I've looked for a physical copy of this to have on my bookshelves for months now at, all our bookstores that are local, at Barnes and Noble. I didn't want to order it online, and I just haven't been able to find it, and I got my hands on it from the library. And I'm really glad I eventually did, because this one would have been unhauled within the next couple of months, because this just didn't speak to me as much as I really thought it would. That being said, this is beautiful. I think it's incredible for its age group. This is unfortunately just another one I think I was too old for, and it just didn't resonate with me the way that I wanted it to. We're following a group of women and women of color that have come into magic, and they are called the Wild Ones, and they need to save and help save the young man who assisted them on their journey initially. It's very fun. There are parts of this that are, you have these like memories here, and they're basically just poems, and there are sections at some of the ends of the chapters that are almost like reflections on womanhood and femininity and what it means, and how women are extra vulnerable in certain aspects. And it's very interesting. I think it's very well written, but it just overall was not for me, partially because I'm too old, and partially because this just partially because I don't love super magical books all the time. And this one has so much to do of traversing worlds and the magic that these girls have, and the way that they interact with magic, and the way magic interacts with the world. And that's just not always for me. And it was just the case with this one here. That being said, this was still 3 stars. It's fun. It's enjoyable. I just don't think it didn't strike the right balance for me. That's what it did. It didn't strike the right balance for me. There's almost too much silliness and goofiness that is cutting some of the tension out from the serious subjects that are handled in here, like child trafficking and, rape and assault and things like that. It's almost too funny in certain places, and the magic is also very, very loose in places, while also being incredibly strict in others, and not in a way that I found very cohesive. But it's a beautiful story. It's absolutely really, really well written and very well told, and all of the characters are very interesting in here. I just wanted this to be 5 stars, and I was positive it was going to be, and it's only 3, so it's very disappointing. So that's it. Those are my May books that I read. The wrap-up. The thing. I don't know. I all of a sudden lost the ability to throw a sentence together. That's not that surprising, though. If you enjoyed this, do the algorithm things. If not, don't. Or even if you enjoyed it, you don't have to do algorithm things if you don't want. I don't really care. I hope you have a great day, and don't watch this. Bye.